So when you read, when one fish dies, we think something is wrong with the fish, but when half the fish are floating belly up, then you go, something must be wrong with the lake.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's kind of like that, I think, those metaphors.
I mean, the metaphors of a lot of these things are so powerful and have us rethinking, reevaluating, just where we are, or how we have understood something that, on its face seemed to be, benign but actually problematic when you really began to investigate and interrogate it. So here we are. Hopefully I'll see
Excuse
Dina.
me 1 second, I'll be right back.
Sure. And I'll see Dina sign on hopefully in a moment. I'm going to text her just to find out where she is, so I'll know how to start.
I'll be right back too.
Okay, everybody grab what you need to. This is the moment.
Some water.
Rainey, you haven't been to Bentonville yet?
I have not. The only group with Walmart was the one that you and I did in San Bruno.
Oh, okay, right. We were in San Bruno doing
digital team.
with the online, I forgot what they're called there. Yeah. So, but Monica's there in Bentonville. Monica, what is Kabir's title?
Yeah, he works at .org, the foundation, and he oversees, he's a senior director. He oversees national and international disaster and volunteerism and community giving.
Okay.
So he's kind of over the community piece of things at the foundation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent, excellent. I actually thought about having him join us, but I didn't know if he would want to do that, since, where he's positioned right now and what he's doing, but that was a thought.
Oh,
absolutely.
Okay. He would love it.
Okay, well, I'll have to remember that, yeah.
Yeah.
It was, Dina and I were sitting around trying to think about who of our collective of friends and partners and participants might be ideal for this. So we had a couple of people, 1 or 2 that couldn't make it, but trying to figure that out. Now, the other interesting part of tonight is that I don't know where anybody's, except for Rainey's, really roots are. So even Mukta, as I probably once knew yours, I don't remember. So I'm going to have you kind of talk about too, where you're, which country you're representing, and contextualizing kind of even the frame of that and what that has meant to the settlement of your group in this country. I mean, I just think there's so many different ways we could go with this, and but I'm super hyped and excited.
There too. I know. I don't know how you keep it straight. You meet so many people in all of your workshops.
I do. It's funny though, the first 2 weeks or 2 months after doing a workshop, and Rainey knows, I could remember everybody's name within a few hours of the workshop. So their names would stay with me for weeks later. I mean, weeks. And then about a month or 2, it starts fading because you're not seeing people again. So you can't hold on to all of that. But the wonderful thing is that, when you connect with people again, you see people, you know them. There is the film that we show called Race, the Power of an Illusion. I don't know if you guys remember that. No, it's not. It's Unnatural Causes, is Inequality Making Us Sick. There's a Black woman that's featured in that piece on When the Bow Breaks. David and you and Ari might remember it. And recently we reconnected with her, and I didn't know, I kept looking at her because we were in a session doing a consultation with people. And you see that person, you say, I know you. but I don't know where I know you from and how I know you, right? So I spent literally 4 or 5 weeks, Dina, Suzanne, and none of us said it to each other. All of us were having the same experience. We know her. All of us individually that we know her. Finally, somebody told us, she's in that film. She's the featured Black lawyer
Oh,
in that
she's
film.
the lawyer.
Yeah, she's the lawyer. Remember,
Yeah.
she's
Wow.
preterm births, and she's being talked about that in spite of her economic positioning, she still had this crisis around her baby's birth, So yeah, so that's how faces can linger in the brain, and work on us. So we got about a minute, and I'll kick us off whether Dina has joined us or not. I haven't gotten a response from her to my text message, which might be a sign that either she's caught up or a sign that she may be in the car and not looking at it. Yeah. So any last questions or concerns? No, everybody's good?
Good. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, it is, let's see, it is 6:30. And I want to say, first and foremost, good evening to everybody who's back with us today. I never know who's going to show back up. I'm delighted, along with Dina and the Black Pearls, that you show up at all, that you're here, that you join us. Tonight is a special night, but every episode that we do is a special episode. But I'm super hyped and excited tonight. But before I actually make introductions of the special guests that are here and have joined us, I do like to say a little bit about, always for people who may be joining for the first time, a little bit about why we're doing this and who are the Black Pearls. So I start by saying that the Black Pearls is a recently founded organization founded by Dina and myself, intended to connect Black women who are willing and courageous and invested in, first of all, recognizing that race is an issue, that systemic and institutional racism is a profound impact to everything that we do inside of our professions, but who have also committed to help keep race on the table, to be that person, that presence in their institutions and organizations who call for accountability, to recognize that race is impactful, and that to the degree that we understand that, we accept that, is the degree to which we can begin to solve the problems of ever widening disparities in our organization. So there are right now about 15, 16 women, most, holding prominent positions in and around largely the state of North Carolina, and folks who are interested in wanting to become a part of that. So that's who the Black Pearls are. And actually, Dina and myself are 2 of those pearls, and there's several of us that are actually connected to Racial Equity Institute. So what we decided to do was to take what we know, the experience, the exposure, and the work that we do, and that while the pandemic gave us lucrative opportunities that had never been explored. Since most of us have been forced home and are now having to operate, being in touch with people, these wonderful faces I'm seeing here are faces that typically I would have seen in their location. Well, the pandemic opened up the whole Zoom possibilities. And so Dina and I talked about that in many of our settings where we train and we work and we talk about what people are doing once they've gone through this training to begin to address structural and institutional racism. People keep asking, what are other folks doing? What do people do after the workshop is over? How do people organize? So this was an intentional effort to begin to talk about that organizing and to allow each of these episodes and groups to be mentors to other groups. Here's what we did. Maybe what a school system did isn't relevant to what you're doing if you are operating in hospitals and healthcare. But what we knew was that inevitably, whatever is being shared has value and that people can learn from it. So I continue to get daily emails with people thanking us for these episodes, wanting to share them with others and saying how instructive they were. Last week, we were blessed to have, for the past 2 weeks, July, I think 23rd and July 16th, we had 10 white organizers from different places in the country who have been doing this work, who have committed themselves to this work. And we had 2 weeks of conversation about that commitment, the struggles and challenges, the celebrations, the kinds of things that come out of that work, the rewards and the benefits. And so we talked about that. One of the conversations probably no one ever has is with the Asian community. And I got to tell you, no sooner than I thought about that, I opened up the Boston Globe, or I got some little thing over the internet to begin to talk about. The Boston Globe presented an article which actually was titled, that Asians, in fact, I'm looking at it here, Asian Americans long used as a racial wedge are confronting anti-Black racism in their own communities. So hence, tonight, there are a multiplicity of questions we want to pose to this group. I have with us tonight, first and foremost, I got to say this to the nation, that Dr. Mukta Jost is with us. And if any of you think you recognize her name, you probably do. If you've been in a racial equity workshop, you know that we pretty much close our work by citing her article, When the Rules Are Fair, But the Game Isn't, where she centerpieces Monopoly to a group of her students that she's trying to teach about racism. And so she is a celebrity in our circle, even as many of you may have never met her. So we have Dr. Mukta Jost, who's also a resident of Greensboro, North Carolina, and we're excited that she could join us. We have Dr. David Shee, who's out of Eau Claire, University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, and has become a friend to the Racial Equity Institute because of work that he's doing in addressing structural and institutional racism there in that community. We have Rainey Land, who is actually a trainer with the Racial Equity Institute, but who has done phenomenal work in beginning to organize training and groups with regard to a discussion of race, structural and institutional racism in the California, Los Angeles area of California, even extending all the way up to San Francisco. We have Monica Kumar, who has come to us and is present tonight with us from Bentonville, Arkansas. And you guys got to know that's one of the retail hotspots of the country, the home of the Walmart community. And Monica has been doing a lot of organizing there in Bentonville. She's partnered with one of our very good friends, Sean Barney, and we'll talk with her tonight about that. And then we have Dr. Ari Anand, who is also partnered in a way with the work that is being done in Eau Claire. He is also in Eau Claire, where David Shee is also located. And so Ari and David have become great friends, what do you call it? Thought partners and folks who absolutely have begun to address structural and institutional racism in their community. We invited them on one occasion to come to Greensboro, North Carolina, to present and share with people here. So tonight is about centering a conversation for us, maybe perhaps for the first time, with a group of Asians representing various communities from around the globe. And so first and foremost, I just want to say welcome, and that we're so glad to have you guys. And I think just the way that it makes sense to open this up in a way that I can't do is to have each of you introduce yourself by kind of talking about the country that you represented, that your family, your ancestors hail from, and begin to talk about, if you will, but your connection also. How is it you became conscious of race and racism and you connect to this work? So even if you don't cover all of that, we'll double back. But I'm going to start with you, Dr. Jost, since you're the first person in my frame to give you an opportunity to talk, to speak.
Great, thank you, Monica. And I'm assuming it's all pretty informal with first names here.
Absolutely.
Please call me Mukta. And I always say it's easy, a very easy name to say. It's like Martha, and it's Mukta, just for the others. But so happy to be here this evening. Greetings to everyone that we can't see and those that we can see. So I am from India, from the city of what used to be Madras when I was growing up, and now it's called Chennai, went back to its Tamil roots. And you know, when it comes to identity for Asian Americans, it's really so fragmented and fragile. I don't really know. I've never called myself Asian American, you know, until I came here. I didn't realize that identity was such a big issue. And if anything, I think the only identity maybe I take on is linguistic. I'm Tamil. And I take that on more as something that has enriched me rather than that separates me or draws a boundary around me. It's a very old language, and I think sometimes I know words in that language that I have thoughts related to those words, but I don't have a parallel in other languages. So that kind of just tells me there's something unique about linguistic identity. But other than that, I grew up in India, very, very rich and wonderful childhood. I could not ever ask for a different kind of childhood. It wasn't all roses. I saw a lot of the ups and downs of a society that was divided by caste. But, the time that I was growing up, there we had friends and neighbors who were Muslims and Christians and Catholics and Protestants. I had no idea, honestly, that there's such deep divisions as a child, because if one of the kids got hurt or was ill, everybody got on their knees and prayed, and it doesn't get better than that, because it kind of was a common thing that drew us. And of course, it wasn't all, romance and being together. But that's the kind of childhood I had in India. And I know that India is not the same now. So, and I left in the early 80s, and I've been back only twice. So not to say, that, oh, it was roses, but it's definitely changed. So that's my background. And very quickly, I think the second part of that question was, so what brought me into this fold of, structural racism? And for me, it was so dramatic. I got off the plane. I mean, literally got off the plane. And I had an official stamp my passport and tell me, ma'am, welcome to America. Stay away from the Black neighborhoods. And I think, Monica, I've shared that with you. And it was at that time, I put it away because it was a memorable thing in a way, but didn't have the opportunity to explore it in context. And then as things happened over the years, and we started raising children, started raising biracial children, there were all these little things that would pop up. And I would compare it to like an optical illusion. You go around, you're living, thinking this is how it is because you're told a certain story. But then when you realize the story of Black, criminalizing Black children, Black community, then it starts to stand out. And that's how I realized a few years into living here, there's this pattern, and they are small events, happening in the classroom, happening when you get off the plane, but there's a narrative that's shared with me as an immigrant here. And I think that's what got me into this work. So those little events, but that had a pattern. And to this day, I feel that whole criminalization that we internalize as we come into this country then really starts to influence our relationship with the Black community. But then I had a totally different and wonderful story, because then I worked for 21 years at a HBCU, which is another story. But I'll stop now, Monica.
Oh yeah, no, all of those are going to be hugely important, because they're frames, they're ways of understanding, there are ways of even beginning to talk about how we got, what was the socialization that also began to tell another story, to introduce yet another story. So we'll come back to that, Mukta. David.
Okay, thanks, Monica. I just wanted to thank the Black Pearls for this invitation to talk to you tonight. I am a professor of English at the University of Wisconsin at Eau Claire, and I'm Chinese American. So I'm also an immigrant, but not by much. And what I mean by that is that I came to this country when I was 1. And I was born in Hong Kong and was raised in California, but mostly in Texas, in a suburb of Dallas. And so I consider myself Asian American, Chinese American. And one thing I've noticed about Wisconsin, and I've been here for about 20 years, so I'm kind of curious to hear from the folks around the other parts of the country. And most of my interaction when I'm talking about racism is with my students. What I've discovered is that they really don't say Asian American. They might say Asian, they might say Hmong, they might say Chinese, but they don't say Asian American. And I think it's really interesting. In fact, I tell them, I say, you're more likely to use this neologism Latinx than you are to say Asian American.
Mm.
And I want you to think about why that is. And of course, I've got my own reasons. And I'm just kind of curious, how widespread that is. But lately, when I think about myself, it's, I guess it's logical given what I study. I actually kind of think about myself quite often as just East Asian. And when I think about myself as East Asian, it's because I'm thinking in terms of power rather than culture or ethnicity. Asian American being such a broad, diverse group. When I introduce myself as East Asian, what I'm really kind of saying to you is, you can't, put me under this monolithic group and think only in terms of culture. And maybe I'll get a chance to talk later tonight about this presentation that I give here at the university called Asian American is Not a Culture. I talk about it being a racial identity, and I talk about what binds all of us on this panel together as a race. But so when I say East Asian, I want people to understand that I have a certain amount of privilege in this country that may put me much closer to whiteness than other people from other Asian American ethnicities who are in this country. As far as what brought me to this work, as I said to you, I'm an English professor and my specialty is Asian American literature. So, I've been studying Asian American literature for a long time and was, teaching Asian American literature here since, 1999. And when you do that, you think about yourself in a certain way relative to race and racism, that you kind of convince yourself that you know what it is, you know what it looks like, you know what the dynamics look like, you know what the nature is. And I would say that I kind of happily thought about myself that way for about 7 or 8 years. And that was when I first met Dina and Suzanne, when we did our Dismantling Racism organizing here at UW Eau Claire. And I can still recall this dinner that we had together. And I was leading this anti-racist professional development that brought in what was then called Dismantling Racism and is now, the Racial Equity Institute. And we were eating dinner and I was still a very young professor and I was saying diversity this, diversity that. And I think it was Suzanne, I can't remember whether it was Dina or Suzanne, but I think it was Suzanne who kind of, stopped me at that moment. She said, David, let's get something straight. We're not like diversity consultants or anything like that. We're community organizers.
That would be Suzanne.
Okay. And and it kind of stopped me cold because, as I said, I thought that I knew what I was talking about. But kind of in the worst sense of the word, it was all academic. And I would say that was a real turning point for me because, those years there were a confluence of forces that kind of upended my consciousness. But I would say that Dismantling Racism and my friendship with Dina and Suzanne was one of the most powerful.
Excellent. Excellent, David. Thank you for that. And I'm just going to continue. Rainey, you're next in my frame.
Good afternoon. My name is Jenny Lynn. Monica, I just want to thank you and Dina, who's not here yet, but thank you for the invitation to be here. And I'm just absolutely honored to be in the presence of, again, we have, REI celebrities here, Dr. Jost, and, and so I'm just absolutely honored to be here. I'm, again, Rainey Lynn. I'm an Asian American, ethnically Taiwanese, and I'm also a transgender American. My parents are both Taiwanese, and they actually, were married in Taiwan, and 2 weeks later moved to the United States, to Texas, actually, to where my dad was pursuing education. That's actually where my sister was born, which was in Lubbock, Texas. And I was actually very nearly born in Texas, but my father was offered a job in Southern California, and so they moved out there to the LA area where I was born. And so that's sort of my kind of story of immigration. So my parents are both immigrants, and meanwhile, me and my sister are both born here in the United States. as far as, race consciousness, that's a very interesting question, because for me, just even imagining myself on a call with Asian Americans, I wouldn't have, this would be impossible for me to have even imagined even 5 or 6 years ago. Because for most of my life, I actually hated being an Asian American, because of all the experiences that I had growing up, started to internalize all the things, all the messages, all the sort of implicit messages, despite explicit colorblind messages. And what I mean by that is that I grew, I'm probably one of the youngest people on this particular panel. I was born in 1990. And I grew up in Southern California, where we have a very, diverse group of people. And when I went to school, I was bombarded with all of these sort of, they're all equal sort of messages. And I didn't really know what to do with that, because we had all of this sort of signs of diversity in the schools that I went to. We also had all this colorblind language, yet I was still being told over and over all of these racial comments, and I didn't make a sense of that. I just said that my parents are immigrants and had no idea about the sort of the construct of race and how it plays out in the United States. And so I was not prepared as in pre-K and kindergarten and first grade to really handle what was going to be happening in school. So when I started to hear all those comments and realize that people were asking me questions like, why are your eyes so small? Why is your nose so big? Why does your food smell so much? All these sort of racial barbs, and didn't know what to do with that. Yet the explicit messages were that we're all treated equal, and so we should just ignore each other's skin color and just treat everyone the same. And so my strategy to really try to deal with all of that kind of treatment was to try to distance myself from the issue of race, to really move away from it as much as possible. And in doing so, move away from my own people, because my interpretation was that if it's me and everyone who looks like me who is being treated this way, then if I can prove myself not to be Asian, maybe then I can actually not have to deal with that anymore. So I literally was the worst perpetrator of sort of being the Asian who hated being Asian, and so I would do things like in middle school, would be out with my parents, and they would be speaking Taiwanese or Chinese to me in public, and I would literally tell them in front of them in public, I would say, don't speak, Asian language in front of me, and in fact, if you do, I'm going to pretend that you're not my parents, right? I would refuse to make friends with all the other Asian kids at school. I'll be the first person to come out against the Asian Americans. And in fact, and as many Asian Americans can tell the same story about a lunchbox story. And that is the story of being, having, bringing a bagged lunch to school, which was, my mom would pack Asian food, and to be so ashamed of my own food to rather, throw my food away instead of eating it in front of people, and would do that for my entire, from K through 12, just to throw away my lunch every day. And I have a very distinct memory, of coming home one day because I didn't get the chance to throw my lunch away at school. I had to go do it at home, but I couldn't do it in the kitchen because my parents would see. And so I had to go back out into the big trash can. And on my way there, I saw my sister coming back from doing the same exact thing. And so this persisted for my entire, all the way up into my mid-20s. And I just tried to push away this whole issue of race for most of my life. And it wasn't until I was in grad school in North Carolina that, it was very clear that I was struggling with so many things. And I was just so fortunate to have had a conversation with Dr. Junie Ang at UNC Chapel Hill, who was an Asian American professor in my department, who encouraged me to go to a Racial Equity Institute workshop. And that's really where my transformation really started, was just having to go through that process of understanding what has even caused that type of behavior in the first place, and having to sit with that, and so I had to really work through that sort of anger and that sort of being paralyzed by the information, and found that the only way that I could sort of deal with it was to go back to the workshops over and over again until I started to find myself getting plugged into this work. So again, thank you so much for an invitation.
Excellent. Thank you, Rainey. Monica, you're next.
That was amazing to hear, Rainey, because there were so many similarities that I could feel. Thank you so much for inviting me into this space and with this incredible, in this room with these incredible people. I just feel honored, and I want to thank you and Dina and everybody in the room for that. It's amazing to be here this evening. Thank you. Well, I was born in England. My mom is from Jarala, which is a little village in Gujarat in India. And my dad grew up in Uganda. He was bought, his grandfather was bought by the British to Uganda to build the railroads as a slave. And so that's where he was born. And then he left Uganda in the Exodus in 1972 when Idi Amin had all the like it was almost overnight, Asians had to leave Uganda. And so that's how he ended up in England. So I grew up my parents were super poor. My dad barely went to school because he was pretty much like the breadwinner for his very large family from a very young age. And so when I was born, my parents lived in pretty much like an Indian commune. I'd never seen anyone who was not Indian. I was brought up communally by, whichever auntie wasn't working or uncle wasn't working, and all the kids were just together. And then kind of overnight, we went from that, and then my dad ended up in Richmond, of all places, which is the most white, not like upper middle class area you can think of. It's rife with actors. Richard Attenborough has a home there. And he just happened to be asked by somebody to run a shop there for 6 months while this person had to travel. And so they took me out of this place. I didn't even speak English, into Richmond, enrolled me in like real school, and I was set to go. And from then on, I really lived like a double life. When I went to school, I remember I was wearing red pants. And if you know anything about England, even if it's just from Harry Potter, you know that you wear a uniform in every British school. So I remember wearing these red like velvet pants and a purple top, because that's what some kid had outgrown in my little commune. And all these people coming up to me, I remember, and I remember these conversations, like someone touching my hair and my skin and saying, what happens when you shower? And me thinking, well, what happens when you shower? Like, I don't know. And really not even understanding what they're saying because I didn't speak English that well. But I do remember thinking, okay, it's very clear that like, I need to like double my life up here. And then, when we moved to Richmond, it was in the 70s, and London today, I was going to say London today looks very different, but I think we're seeing a rise of nationalism in England. But certainly London then was openly racist, like completely openly racist. I told you we had a shop, and we had to have shutters, metal shutters put onto the windows, because they would people would just come and throw bricks in the windows and break them so many times. My parents couldn't afford to keep doing that. So then they had these metal shutters, and I remember in blue graffiti, them graffitiing Packies Go Home, and me having to kind of understand that. But at the same time, and this is where I have this idea of like where this internalized idea of the model minority starts, is this narrative from my parents: be quiet, work really hard in school, keep your head down, and don't say anything. And so, like I remember the sort of act of violence that I remember was some folks had put like all these lit rags into our mailbox. And our mailboxes in England are in that, like it's like a letterbox in the door of your house. It's not outside. And they put these lit rags in. And so our house was on fire. And it was in the middle of winter. My mom had just had my baby sister. So we're all standing outside. It's snowing. My mom's got like a 4-month-old baby. And we're literally just standing there. The police didn't come. None of our neighbors came out. And my uncle is trying to douse the fire. Like that is my memory of what it means to be kind of Asian growing up young in London. So yeah. And in spite of that, I definitely see that as like a real, it's a part of my identity. I'm British Indian. That's how I see myself. I, a few months ago, had the privilege and honor to become American. So yay, November. But I see myself as British Indian. And I still do. And so my background is that, and the other thing that I remember from very young was saying to myself, what does it mean to really and truly become English and British? One was become white. So I would pray to God every night that I would never tell anyone if he made me white. And I'd just like go find another white house and no one would, a house with white people, and no one would know. You know, I would never tell anyone that secretly God had this special relationship with me. That was one thing. But the other thing I from a very young age in my psyche, and it must have been from a TV show or something, the idea that you become a lawyer. If you truly want to show that you've mastered a culture and a language, you become a lawyer. And so that's what I did. But I actually eventually went from corporate law into human rights law. And this is kind of where my kind of interest in really thinking about what it means to be different and how you support communities that are different started. I represented a lot of asylum seekers in England. And kind of moved into understanding that, you know, the law was one thing, but it was really the communities around these asylum seekers that determined whether they would get residency. And so I really started to understand the way communities support human rights. And that's kind of the work that I started moving into, development and organizing work. And I moved here about 13 years ago, got married to a wonderful, wonderful person, and then moved to Northwest Arkansas about 7 years ago. And I would say that really I've in England, I always, like, the race thing was always on my mind, but from a very sort of, I have to say that in England, there's kind of this collective Asian Black experience of race, and it's different here. So I really would say that really it was really meeting Sean 3.5 years ago. I think I had a very deep sense about incarceration in this country and feeling like that was really unfair. But I didn't have a systemic and institutional understanding of racism until then. And then about 3.5 years ago, Sean invited me to come to New Orleans and do REI. And, you know, it was one of those completely transformational experiences for me, as so many people talk about it. And it just became imperative for me that we do the work in Northwest Arkansas. And so that's what we've been doing in Northwest Arkansas. We started Race Around NWA together, and now we kind of do the work here and build up systems leaders to collectively think about race and equity.
Excellent, excellent, Monica. That leaves you, Ari.
So first of all, I'd like to echo everyone's thank you to Black Pearls, and particularly you, Monica, as well as Dina, for this invitation. Yeah, and I always feel overwhelmed in these situations and sort of like, I'm not worthy. I don't know what the hell I'm doing here. But anyway, here I am. So I'm from India. I was born in India. I never left India until I was 18, and I came to college to the United States right at the very end of the 80s in 1989, in the fall, 3 months before the 90s started. But I think, my childhood in India was not necessarily one I look back at very fondly. I mean, ups and downs like any childhood. But mine was a very color-conscious childhood. I was a dark-skinned kid in environments in which that was unusual. I was born in Mumbai, and then we moved to North India. And I remember being sort of made fun of for having dark skin. And I remember very distinctly when I was about maybe 5 or 6 years old once, trying to lighten my skin using talcum powder. And it was a grotesque thing to do. It was an odd thing to do. And I remember, I don't know how it ended. I just remember feeling very embarrassed and bad about the whole thing. But what I remember is my 20s, after I had started thinking about colonialism and race and also just caste in India, although that was less of a consciousness, part of my consciousness. I told my mother about this, and she thought it was a very cute story. And I just lost it. I got really mad at her, saying there's nothing cute about this crap. It's, this is internalized self, this is self-hatred. And you know, but my mother was using skin whitening creams and all that stuff. This stuff is very common in India. So I think when I came to the US, I was already sort of conscious of some of this stuff, but I didn't have any analysis of race at all. I think I came already somewhat critical of, you know, this sense that the US is a powerful country and it throws its weight around in ways maybe it shouldn't around the rest of the non-white world. But that was it. It was not really a race critique. It was kind of a mild imperial critique. And then when I got to the US, I came to a small college in West Michigan. It was a liberal arts college. I got a scholarship there. There were very few Black students there. This college is halfway between Detroit and Chicago, and there were a few Black students from Detroit. And so it's not like we ever got very close, but I chatted with them on and off. And they would say to me that, you know, you're having a very, because I felt this affinity because we were dark, right? And to me, that was kind of a connection. But they said, no. Life is going to be way easier for you here than it is for us. When we even cross the road here, cars actually speed up when we cross the road. And that's not going to happen to you. It's going to be weird for you, but it's not going to be like us. And I saw that this was true. It was just self-evident to me that being a person of, you know, African descent versus being a person of South Asian descent were very different things, that you're sort of racialized differently. So my own sort of, you know, and I never completely sorted this out for years and years. It was clear to me that there was something weird going on. I didn't fit in here. But then I was encouraged to go to grad school. So I stuck around in this country. I went to grad school. So now it's been, 30 years I've been in the US. I still consider myself to be an Indian. I'm still a green card holder. I haven't sort of taken the plunge and applied for citizenship. My parents are in India. Extended family is all in India. But in grad school, I got interested in, actually even as an undergrad, I think that this general idea of difference in power was always a big thing. It interested me. I think a lot of this happened because it's bad enough being a dark-skinned person in India. We're all dark-skinned, so the whole thing is just insane and ridiculous. But then to come to the US and realize that people in the US have no conception of what the rest of the world is, and they actually have a very condescending and negative attitude towards anyone from India and India itself. So I get weird comments like, you know, first of all, they would confuse me with what are Native Americans or, you know, Indians in the US, American Indians, whatever terminology you use. And so people would say things like how, and I, you know, like not even Native people here use that kind of nonsense, you know, as a greeting. So very weird racist stuff would happen. And I didn't have the race framework to make sense of this. But I did have the framework of colonialism because, you know, I was raised in a nationalist India in the 80s. So I became very interested in colonialism. And I think that started giving me, so I read people like, you know, like international anti-racists or anti-colonial thinkers. I started reading those people. And so my academic work was very anti-colonial. And, you know, but it was never anti-racist until I got to Eau Claire. I went to grad school in Arizona. And by the time I got to Eau Claire was such a white space that it was just a kick in the face. I mean, it was just, you know, Tucson, Arizona it's part of the United States, very similar racial dynamics and all that stuff, but it's just not that white compared to what Eau Claire is like. And here, I remember there was you know, I was a new faculty member and there was a kind of a retreat. And at the retreat, there's the usual, you know, very shallow kind of talk about, oh, we need to be more diverse because this is such a white university and blah, blah, blah. And then someone from one of the departments started complaining because these are faculty members, right? And they're complaining. And the complaint was, oh, we don't, something like we're not, well, we try to hire diverse people, but the administration tells us to hire diversity, but then they shut us down when we try. And then he goes on and explains, he said, well, you know, we offered a job to someone who's Ethiopian. Wouldn't that be great to have a Black Ethiopian man here? But then the administration said, no, that's not diversity. Well, what is diversity then? Blah, blah, blah. And I thought this was a really silly thing to say. And so as a completely new person, I said, well, I think what we mean when we're talking about, and this is where I think, as David pointed out, the diversity language is just useless. So I said, well, the difference is, you know, this actually gives me an insight into why I was hired as an Indian, because I'm a very safe hire as a person of color. None of the people in this country have any baggage with me. White people certainly don't, right? I'm a nice exotic Indian who can show up and color the department. But I think what we're getting at here is that, there's a reason why maybe we need to have a deeper sense of power and history and so on, and particularly race if we're thinking about hiring. I don't know what possessed me to say this as a completely new person, but I would say at least 20 or 30 people came up to me after that and said, thanks for saying that, blah, blah, blah. And I think this gave me a sense of two things. One, this peculiar Midwestern white solidarity, where you have white people who might be somewhat critical of things, but will never express it, which, for whatever reason. And then actually, because I said this, one of the people in my department said, oh, you seem to be interested in issues of race. You should talk to David, which I didn't actually do because I was new and terrified. But then David got in touch with me and said, you should do this dismantling racism thing. And so that's actually, it's really, again, Dina and Suzanne came and did this workshop. That's what got me interested and got me to really start making sense of my experiences in the United States in a way that clarified things rather than left me all muddled. In a way that, and so I think the last thing I'll say is, I'd read people like Malcolm X and Cornel West, and these were people who helped me in my early 20s to start letting go of some of that self-hatred. Like Malcolm, in his autobiography, really talks very powerfully about his own internalized self-hatred and how he learned to love himself in some ways, almost as a spiritual kind of thing. So I think that part of it was healing for me personally. But that part never gave me the kind of institutional and structural critiques that REI or the dismantling racism exposure gave me. I think it gave me something very different. So that's my general sort of story. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
These are all powerful stories. In fact, they're very chilling to me. And I'll launch the next question this way, because I grew up as an African-American child in the state of Alabama. I didn't know any Asian. I didn't know any Latinx. I didn't know any Native American. I knew a world that was specifically and clearly defined as Black and white. So I don't enter into really a world of others and recognizing, nor even as I entered that world of others, as I look in all of your faces, it's still very confused, not clear at all about who you are, not clear at all about all of us really are others, that I'm the other, you're the other, and we're just different others from different places. And so with my lack of clarity and confusion and lack of exposure, because so if you haven't grown up around any of the other cultures, you don't even have any idea or a launching pad from which to work. So my question to you though, so each of you have described, some of you having been here in America longer, really being raised here, while others we immigrated here. But here's one thing that I have come to understand and have been also very, very curious about. And I'm curious about it, not with just Asians. I even would have the same curiosities with Africans coming from the continent. And that is, what is the story? What is that sense of, now you said, Mukta, that literally off the plane, one of the first pieces of advice you're given is to stay away from those Black neighborhoods. But I do want to know, and think it's curious for even the listeners to have a sense of, what is that narrative that either you come with or you learn very quickly about Black people? And so I think I want to center that for this moment for some sharing there, if you will, whichever of you would like to. And I'll let you kind of come at it as you choose to. I won't put anybody on the spot. But if it takes too long, I'll have to. What's the story about us, Mukta?
So I think that, and I'll keep this brief because there's so much to it. We bring, we've internalized things from wherever we came. And I think David said he came when he was a year old. And I'm not sure what a year-old child, sometimes what children learn is very powerful. I wouldn't be surprised if there's something even a 1-year-old brings. So I think, like Ari was describing, there are some very, very powerful, I would say even traumatic childhood experiences that we all go through. It's just, does it balance out? Is it all trauma? Is it all positive, or is there a balance? And sometimes I think a balance is good because you really create and cultivate empathy, because you go through some trauma, you understand trauma in other people, right? And you can sit with them when they are hurting. So I don't think all trauma that way was bad, but it shouldn't always be all of that. So we bring those, internalized things, but the underlying theme is always somebody is better than somebody else. Somebody has made you feel like they're better than you in something, right? And that's kind of a fundamental thing of racism that we've talked about at REI a lot. And then you come here and you really have a different, the story about America that you've seen through movies and read in books is very different. So when you come here, it's very stark, that whole black and white, that stuff. And then you learn it quickly. Now, I think, and I'm really speaking for myself, for Asian Americans, if you look at the statistics, there's some weird stuff going on. So if you look at all immigrants, about 27-28% have college degrees. If you look at Americans in general, it's a little more, 31-32. But you look at Indian immigrants, it's like 80% have college degrees. So they come in very, with their degrees, but not their undergrad, right? So undergrad is your chance for general education where you may learn about some of that stuff, and that's completely skipped. Then you come in, you've gone through a maze of getting a visa, coming in here, and then you are also on this path. You want to get your degree and you want to get your green card and your citizenship, and that all takes years. And at that time, you and your family are the priority. And I think, we talked about color here. It's just a standard thing. I think it's a psychological thing. People try to become, trying to be, wanting to be white. All that is trying to become like the oppressor. So we feel then we may get that same power. And so that happens when you come here. So Asian Americans, we, kind of learn, move into those neighborhoods where it's mostly white, send our kids to schools, teach our kids, that whole criminalization that I was telling you about, telling kids who they can play with, who's good and who's bad. So, it's really in a way, a very distasteful, horrible thing. But at the same time, I want to say right now, I'm 60 years old. I just turned 60. I am so hopeful. I am more hopeful than I have ever been. There have been times I've been so depressed about all this. And Rainey, when she talked, she's exactly the age as our daughter. And when I hear my children talk, and the stuff they've grown up with, the stuff that, we've shared with them, they came with me everywhere. And you know that, Monica. And they are there in the room, right? And that kind of stuff makes such a big difference. So I want to say, yeah, all of that is true. That's just really so negative and just kind of soul crushing. But right now I feel very hopeful. I don't know if that makes sense, if that's kind of what you were after.
Sure. Someone else. What's the story? What is it that is perceived and seen? Because, clearly, the alignment really has not been with African Americans. And so something is driving that. For me, it's not mere accident. There is value, there is whatever are the emotions, the beliefs. And so anybody that's willing to share more of that, what is it?
I can say a little bit. So my family, as I said before, came to this country in 1970. And I think what a lot of folks don't understand is that they came because of an immigration law in 1965 that kind of opened the door for immigration from Asia. But here's the thing, is that it wasn't a completely open door. That is, the immigrants who were allowed to come to this country had to have particular skills that were desirable for the nation. And so what you got was the immigration of a number of very highly skilled Asian immigrants. I think my dad kind of slipped in, and my mom kind of slipped in without having those, say, medical or technological skills that other immigrants from Hong Kong had. And so they were kind of lucky, but they were still part of that larger group that came with resources. right? And some of them probably had jobs waiting for them here within particular industries. And so it was kind of a fast track into the middle class. And Monica, you asked, what's the story? The story is white supremacy. The story is that how is whiteness constructed? Well, whiteness is constructed in large part by where you get to live. And so I grew up in a suburb of Dallas, Texas, which was largely segregated. And I grew up mostly around white people, had mostly white friends, dated mostly white women. And that does a number on you as an Asian American. So there's this, story that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about Trump wanting to rescind an Obama era order that's allowing for low income housing in suburbs, in this kind of ploy to win over white suburban housewives. And it's operating on that logic that to be in the suburbs is to be white. I used, before Trump, I would joke around with my students and I would say, in 20 years, I'm going to be white. And they kind of look at me and they don't really know what I'm talking about. And I said, you're thinking about race the wrong way if you see it as only about phenotype, the way that my body looks. It's really about the rights and access to resources that I have. And now I joke, I say, okay, maybe now it's like 50 years, it's not 20 years anymore.
David, will you hold 1 second?
Sure.
I think one of our, I don't know if it's Dina or Suzanne might be trying to come on, but whoever is coming on, your mic is open and is creating incredible distortion right now. So I'm gonna let you continue, David, and I'm gonna try to see if I can get to Suzanne or Dina. I see Suzanne's name popping up. Is that you, Dina, or Suzanne?
It's Suzanne. I'll go on.
No, you can come on, but something is creating incredible distortion.
Yeah, I hear you. I'll go on.
Okay, go ahead, David. I so apologize for interrupting you.
Oh yeah, no problem. I'll just finish up with this point that, yeah, no doubt, from your family, you get these anti-Black messages, right? Where, my parents would tell my sisters, don't get too tan or you'll look like a Filipino. And so you get it from your family, because of this anti-Blackness that was in place already in places like Hong Kong. But then, you move into the suburbs and then institutionally you are conditioned into this anti-Blackness. So, it's the story of white supremacy that comes from all sides.
Oh, that's great, David. That's very, very helpful. I think I see you, Dina, probably trying to give Suzanne some directions. Okay, great. Thank you. Monica or Ari or Rainey, what's the story? I mean, one of the things I said and I'm thinking is that in my experience, I lived in New York for 20 years, so large populations of Asians there. I never lived in Los Angeles, but when I'm there, large populations of Asians. And one of the things that the story that have been a centerpiece for me is that the news was always, whenever there was major incident, like the killing of Rodney King and the burning down of businesses in LA, the riots, or the riots of some other places. What we find very often is that Asians have been pitted against the African American community, and many of those Asians that are doing business in African American communities, that there's been tension, that there's been separation, that there's been a sense of who belongs and who doesn't. So just to carry that conversation just a little bit further, any one of you that will, the three of you, Ari, Monica, or Rainey.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a very British sense of what it means to grow up in England, and unpacking that, I recently read, I started reading Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People by Rennie Edo-Lodge, and she really helped me understand some of the things around growing up in England, what it felt like to be a person of color. But I think, my first, so I used to be married to someone who was Black, but he was from the Turks and Caicos, which is a British colony just off the south of the Bahamas. And we lived in the Turks and Caicos for about 8 years. And now in retrospect, I can say that it was very similar to living in England in many ways as a person of color, even though, you know, I'm married and he's Black, we're in a Black family. And what really sticks out to me about kind of thinking about the narrative of what it means to be Black and then in America was, I remember our first experience coming to America. We were still dating at the time, and we were taking a vacation to Miami. And I remember that we were at a stoplight, and somehow, for some reason, the person behind us, you know, thought that we weren't moving when we should have or something, and the light had turned, and you know, they thought we were doing something on purpose. So they like start shouting racist expletives out of the window. They're white, you know, I'm a person of color, he's Black, and they like, and I mean, they start gunning for us. And for the next 7 or 8 minutes, and we're literally just off the airport. This is my first time coming to America, and they're gunning for us, and they're trying to like, and this you know, they've got the window down, they're shouting these racist expletives, and eventually, I mean, it was like a 7 or 8 minute car ride, and eventually we had a smaller car than they did because, you know, we're really poor and they had a nice big car, and we went down a little alley, and I remember him turning to me and saying, you know, welcome to being Black in America. And I remember thinking, I mean, yeah, I get it, but it's kind of like being Indian in England too. Like, yeah, people, you know, you have racist experiences. And then I remember on the way home at the airport, he gave up his green card. And I thought it was insane that a person would voluntarily give up his green card. And he literally said to me, I never have any intention of living in America. I know that. I don't want to be Black in America. And I thought it was crazy. And I have to say that now, like everything that I'm learning and that, especially through REI, but just, you know, the work that I've been doing since then, it gives me a really different understanding of what it means to be, what I felt the person of color, the Indian Asian experience was in England compared to what it means to be Black in America. They're just, you know, I talk about this all the time. It's a very, very, it's a far-reaching experience, and it's a very different experience. And I always think about that when that piece of turning to me and saying, welcome to being Black in America. And I'm starting to finally unpack what he meant by that.
Excellent, thank you. Rainey, do you want to jump in there perhaps?
The first thing I'll say, just to, you know, what you were saying, David, I think really is almost like the story of my family, right? Because my parents are like those immigrants who were, you know, part of that selective immigration process. My dad went to Texas because to pursue his PhD in engineering, and so, you know, that's like that's one part of that story. But, you know, to answer your question, Monica, the narrative, you know, was never explicitly like anti-Black. And it was largely due to what David said, was to geography, you know, that my dad being positioned as, you know, after graduating with his PhD in Texas, moving to California, you know, had access to, you know, geographical neighborhoods that, you know, when you look at those maps, you know, where people are living by race in Los Angeles, as diverse we are when you look demographically for the whole county, you can see distinctly that people are living in different parts of the neighborhood by race. And so, you know, just, you know, I live in Redondo Beach, California. It's an extremely white neighborhood in Los Angeles. And it's almost all white with some Asian, you know, and so it's like there's sort of this you know, a subset of Asian Americans who have been allowed to be sort of adjacent to whiteness. And so the message was never explicitly anti-Black, but it was always like just trying to sort of align as closely to white as possible. And implicitly me, you know, just not even, you know, just by virtue of where I lived and the schools I went to and everything, you know, I didn't need to be told, you know, that like all these negative explicit narratives about Black people all I need to know was just like where I was living and you know, just kind of confirm with my own beliefs, you know, like who we should align with, you know. And so for me, it was far more implicit than explicit. Now, you know, I would love for, you know, I know you asked another question, Monica, but I want to make sure I understand that question. If you could just repeat that second part of that question, that would be great.
Well, the part of it is that there has been, when you say the message is not a direct message of anti-Blackness, but perhaps a lot more subtle, or perhaps even the message is that if you're being told to move closer to whiteness and you're living in a white reality, you know, where there is the lack of a Black presence, however it is playing out, what it has done in this country is created an indirect then tension, and maybe not so indirect tension, between Black people and Asian people. And so what we've seen it do in occasions where there has been racial unrest in cities and across the United States, it spilled over, it's exploded. I mean, the Rodney King, the aftermath of the Rodney King trials was the most prolific example. The Boston Globe article that I'll bring up now because I just think that it makes sense, says that, you know, Asians have, now this is the Boston Globe in an article, it's being said that Asians have for a long time been used as the wedge. Many of you already have mentioned model minority. Well, what we see now is the article centers around the young Asian man who stood by as Chauvin put his knee on George Floyd. So the question that arose, it cast Asians pivotally, if you ask me, in the experience of now, you talk about proximity to whiteness, well, then that's a kind of complicity with whiteness. So that the question that has been raised, particularly amongst young Asians, and particularly where they're trying to be active and supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, that many of them now are registering that while they support it, they come from communities that are starkly opposed to their supporting the Black Lives Movement. So I'm trying to center at least some response to how we are understanding that, how you as representatives who work around racism and anti-racism, you know, how do we explain that? How do we understand that?
Yeah, I think, I was watching the documentary on PBS, Asian Americans, which I highly recommend. And, you know, I love the way that in their 5th episode that they parallel the murder of Vincent Chin to, you know, the murder of, you know, several murders of that you can parallel to that where an Asian American was involved, such as Latasha Harlins, near the right before the acquittal of the officers in the Rodney King trial. As well as, even just thinking about a few years back, Peter Liang and Akai Gurley in New York, and, what happened just a few months ago with Mr. Floyd. And so I think, that, the way that they juxtapose that is extremely important, because what has happened is we saw the community rally around the murder of Vincent Chin, who was a Chinese American who was murdered by, group of white people, after during in fact, he was sort of confused as a Japanese American, and this was an instance of fatal racial violence against a Chinese American because they were blamed for taking jobs away in Detroit. And what had happened in the Chin trial was that the officers were, eventually on appeal acquitted of, of any kind of responsibility for that murder. And, there was, mass, rallying in the Asian American community during that time around justice for Vincent Chin. And we saw, like the rallying support of Black Americans, for justice for Vincent Chin. And so, we have, in fact, there's a clip in that documentary where you see, Jesse Jackson, who was, in running for a presidential bid at the time, take, some time off of that campaign to, in support of this movement. And so we saw the communities, rally together, for that. Yet just, not too long after that, we have an incident where you have a Korean, shop owner, murder Latasha Harlins. And so, and then all of a sudden we kind of just see this sort of almost like a flipping, of we were just the victims of a fatal, racial violence incident, into now being a perpetrator, and then not seeing the commonality between Latasha Harlins and Vincent Chin, we're not seeing the, you know, the commonality between Vincent Chin and Kai Gurley or George Floyd. And so what the documentary says is, though, because so much of it, you know, we just talked about immigration, is that so much of, you know, the community, you know, in Koreatown, for example, in the 90s, was a largely immigrant population who had no prior knowledge to the sort of civil rights movement and to the sort of racial history of the United States. And that causes a lot of that divide and misunderstanding, you know, that actually the whole result of this, in fact, when you even just look at those, the LA, you know, riots, you know, in the 90s, that these were two communities that have been pitted against each other, and that the media had played up all the racial tensions between Koreans and Latinos and Black Americans in LA without any sort of spotlight on what has caused, you know, that in the first place, which was, you know, centuries of exclusion of all people of color, you know. And so, you know, lacking a sort of historical understanding, you know, we can see, you know, an article that you mentioned, Monica, you know, it reminds me of what happened in the past, you know, and seeing how there's this almost this divide and this confusion among the Asian American community on not knowing where to stand.
Excellent. Thank you, Rainey, for that. Ari?
Yeah, I was going to add also that the narrative, I think, at least from an Indian perspective, I think it's almost impossible to have a narrative that is divorced from our narrative of Africa. And I think it's fair to say that in India, there's a very strong narrative of Africa as a backward place. And this is just a colonial stereotype we've all inherited. And I think we transpose that onto African Americans. And so it's a very, you know, this is why I think, you know, this is sort of the international dimension of racism, which also exists. It's not purely, we know it's not purely a US phenomenon. It's a broader phenomenon as well. I don't think it plays out the same way everywhere, and I don't want to conflate things too much. But I know that part of my inheritance as an Indian was a very sort of anti-African kind of set of prejudices, particularly sub-Saharan African. So I think, and as Rainey said, none of this stuff is explicit, right? But it is implicit in that, and this was actually pointed out, this is a long history. I think way back in the 20s, W.E.B. Du Bois actually pointed that, you know, Indians, especially caste Indians, have this idea in their head that somehow they are like Europeans and not like the rest of us. And he said, this is actually, you know, I mean, not in so many words, but he actually said, you guys are going to have a rude awakening when you realize that Europeans don't think you're European, right? You can stick to your Aryan mythologies as much as you want, but ultimately, you might want to think about having solidarity with the Black and brown people of the world rather than with the white people of the world. This is an old story in India, I guess is what I'm saying. So I think for those of us from India, we're actually very well equipped to bring to the US when we come here as immigrants an anti-Black narrative. I think we've been prepped for it, we've been primed for it, and we bring it with us. And I think for many of us, there's a, you know, and this I think leads, this is why we are so useful as the model minority, right? Because we're already halfway there. We just want people to keep telling us, yeah, you'll belong, you'll whiten someday.
Wow.
So I don't know if that's helpful in answering your question, but based on my experience, that's definitely a dimension of the narrative of Black people that I think Indian immigrants are very likely to have. And I'll give you a quick story. My first semester in the US, my grandfather visited the US from India on business. And he picked me up in Holland, Michigan, where I was in college, and we drove to Chicago. And as you drive into Chicago, you drive through the south side of Chicago, and you drive through some Black areas of Chicago, obviously very segregated. And he's pointing out at boarded houses and stuff and telling me, look at these Black people, they're so lazy. And even at the time, because I'd already been speaking to these Black students in the college that I was at, I said, I think there's something more complicated going on here. But for India, you know, in India, we're used to seeing poverty and justifying it. There is so much poverty in India. And we have mythologies and narratives justifying it. That say, you know, whether it's these people deserve this karmic fate or whatever it is, you know, I won't get into all that. So I think for Indians, seeing poverty is not shocking to us, and it's something we can justify. And I think when you combine that with the kind of anti-African or anti-Black kinds of narratives, and then of course the colorism comes in. I mean, there's just a lot to throw into the hopper here when it comes to trying to understand Indian understandings of Black folks and assumptions we make. So yeah, I'll stop there. But hopefully that gets at some of, I think, what your question was, hopefully.
No, that's powerful. And I know Dina is going to be jumping in. I want her to ask some questions based on her experience and her knowledge and the time that she spent with all of you. What I will say, that's very helpful because I think what each of you have accomplished in a sense is the incredible differences that exist culturally for each of you coming from the places that you did. It's not the same, can't be lumped. But one of the frames of racism is the power of lumping, that we just make, all of this group is just this group. You're all, no cultural distinctions, no differentiated history, no, none of that, but that you're just a part of the Asian group, the model minority, as Latinx with all of this incredible diversity also becomes another mass group, and it just doesn't work like that. But I want to give Dina a chance to jump in and just presume I haven't asked anything you wanted to ask and ask that. She said she doesn't know what I've asked already.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. I'm so excited I'm sorry I'm late. Anyway, had a meeting related to the school system, but so glad to see my friends, because I've had the opportunity to work with just about all of you. You have shaped my lives in such profound ways. Mukta, you and I, and our little M group.
That's right.
Yeah, we go way back, a couple of decades. And so, what's Asian people's roles in organizing and in anti-racism work? Because I think part of the sort of racial triangulation is also to individualize Asians, and lumping them together at the same time. And so you've taken people from just, continents and languages and cultures and put them all together and call them Asians. And then there's this individualism too, that's a part of that. And so what are Asian people's roles in organizing and working towards racial equity? I know you're working, I know, Mukta, what you've done working at a historically Black college and university. I know what David and Ari are doing, working at a historically white college and university where, I've heard both of your stories. One is that, Mukta, you've been picked on for being the diversity lady, bringing up issues of race by the Black people. And David and Ari get pushed back from students if they push too hard. And then, or not even push too hard, but just bringing the subject up. And then, how your colleagues are having to figure out if they're going to join on. Monica, I know that you've been, organizing in a predominantly white community, and Rainey's organizing, so she's actively involved. You're all organizing in some kind of way. So I know a little bit more about, because Rainey's connected to REI on our side, but can you just say a little bit about what would you advise Asian people to do that, how can they find their place in this movement for racial justice and racial equity?
We're all very polite, waiting for somebody else to start. I think there's going to be as many ways to do this as there are Asians, because experiences are different. And I'll just speak about, my experience where I felt that, that kind of gratification from addressing a problem that I caught on to, right? And so I've done the, beating drums on the street and protesting, but I always went back to education. I went back to the classroom because I liked that kind of taking that extended period of time to read something together, watch a movie together, play a game together, design an experience for students where you ask, white teachers to go to their Black students' homes and neighborhoods and come back with a totally different experience and read their reflection, right? Not telling people this is how it should be, but leading them and guiding them and giving them the opportunity. So I felt in my classrooms, one of the, kind of hair-raising goosebump moments for me was having that ability to have Black teachers and white teachers in the classroom, and then having them talk to each other and them saying, we've never had this opportunity. We've never had this opportunity to sit down and hear a Black teacher, a Black person talk about their experience, or a white person talk about their experience. So for me, it was always going back to that, and that collective, I felt that was very democratic, that together we thought about it, together, maybe it wasn't as fast as, as sometimes we would want it, but some people changed their minds, some people it planted seeds, and now years later, and like you said, Dina, it was decades ago, but I still have students writing to me, especially now with what's going on in the country. So that's been, for me personally, the most gratifying way to organize support. And that way I didn't feel alone, because if you start feeling alone in this journey, you're not going to do well. You're not going to be effective.
You're muted, Dina.
I could say a little bit. So one of the joys of having Ari as a colleague is that I can tell him what I'm thinking and not really have to explain myself at all. And so about a week ago, I said, Ari, sometimes my heart really isn't in it when people expect me to talk about anti-Asian racism, because I want to talk about anti-Black racism. And I say I'll do it, and sometimes I do it as a favor. And yes, it's important. Yes, Trump shouldn't be getting people to say China virus. And yes, people die because of it. But I'll also say that, if people stop saying that to me out in public, and things kind of return to the way they were several years ago, I'm not going to be free. And I don't want to fool myself into thinking because anti-Asian racism has abated that I'm going to be free. Nobody's free until there's Black liberation. So about 2 months ago, we had this Zoom presentation from our Office of Multicultural Affairs, and I hope nobody from that office is listening tonight, because I was giving a presentation for AAPI Heritage Month, and these are my friends, and they said, David, could you talk about the bamboo ceiling? And I thought, I don't really want to talk about the bamboo ceiling. Okay, I will. So I'll talk about the bamboo ceiling. And so much of the presentation was perfunctory. And if you know what the bamboo ceiling is, it's basically that Asian Americans can only rise so high in kind of corporate America because they're not seen as natural managers or people persons. But what I kind of did a little trick at the end. I turned it back to talk about anti-Blackness and white supremacy. I mean, when we talk about Asian contagion, that's not a new idea, and that's not an idea that arrived with Asians. Like when you want to talk about contagion, you want to talk about disease. I mean, so much of these tropes and narratives can be traced and should be traced back to anti-Blackness. And that would be my advice, Dina, for Asian American activists, which is you're not free until there's Black liberation. And maybe that's where you should be putting your energies.
Wow, that's really powerful, David. Monica?
Monica Kumar.
Thank you. Sorry, it took me a minute to unmute. So I'm actually in an interesting place here in Northwest Arkansas because we actually have a very large South Asian population because of Walmart. So there's probably 6,500 to 7,000 of us here. And my work kind of has in the Asian community, in the South Asian community until very recently, really until the George Floyd protests, has really focused on arts engagement and curation of culture. And so, of course, I've been doing racial equity work for a long time, but the two just have not met until the George Floyd murder and then the protests. And then I started getting very active in the social space in my South Asian communities. So on the Facebook and Twitter, on all of that. And I got very strong pushback. So the community here is, which I was, kind of surprised about, because until then, I'm kind of used to the British Indian community, which is a few generations ahead than here. And they're talking about anti-racism, and they're talking about the Black experience with police and different things like that. And so I wasn't expecting that. And then I'm now a little bit banned in the South Asian community on the Facebook pages and the social media. But, you know, and I find it, and really a lot of it comes down to this idea of kind of like my parents, like, be quiet. We have these incredible jobs here. We make really good money. Most of them are in IT or tech. And I'm not kind of stereotyping, it just is a fact here in this community. And then, and so my work, and then I'm also in touch with young social Indian activists, the kids of these parents, and they are at the protests, and they're activating really strongly with their with the other young Black and white students in the community. So I'm kind of acting as a mentor to them, but also I'm not going to give up on the South Asian community here. And so I've identified a couple of leaders who did respond to me and say, hey, I hear what you're saying. This might not be the forum, but we would love to think about how we can engage people and folks in having a better conversation. And some of those leaders are actually coming to an REI training that I've invited them to, that's going to be next week. So I'm hoping that we can ease into that on that side. But, you know, I want to mention that, to me, like if you think about like Adam Purinton, who pulled the gun and shot the two Asian, I think he shot both of them and killed one of them. I think he killed Srinivas. I mean, that's the community. These are two tech engineers who are from India, who have been killed by a white supremacist. And the hush, let's not talk about it conversation is really interesting to me. But again, I'm going to go back to what David said. Until we start really and truly getting into solidarity with Black men, Black women, and our Black community in this country, we're never going to be accepted. We're never going to be accepted as white. We're not, you know. And I think that this weaponization of the model minority needs to be really pulled into focus.
Well, that's so powerful and helpful, Monica, because, you know, I know that there are a lot of, you know, Asian organizers, Asian young people out there that don't have any role models. You know, we always talk about mentors and role models, especially for at-risk kids. And we don't have any for, you know, other racial subgroups, helping them navigate this invitation, you know, this conditional invitation that you can come here, but, you know, and you'll get some, what does Claire Jean Kim call it, Rainey? You'll get some relative value, but you're still going to be civically ostracized, you know? And so that was really powerful. Ari?
Yeah, I want to echo what David and Monica said. I think it's funny when David said that his heart isn't into it when he's doing, you know, the anti-Asian stuff. I mean, it was a relief to hear him say it. I mean, we'd never talked about this. I've been away for a year. We haven't met in over a year now because of COVID anyway. It was a relief. And I think that the key solidarity has to be an accountability to the fundamental bedrock of what racism is. And I think, you know, this all reminds me of a beautiful phrase. So I think, who was it who said, "How does it feel to be a problem"? Wasn't it Du Bois? Somebody, there was a famous, you know, someone, it was a Black writer saying, you know, we are identified as a problem. You know, how does it feel to be a problem? And there's an Indian writer called Vijay Prashad who writes about all kinds of stuff. But he had this great piece in which he's talking to Indian Americans. And he says, how does it feel to be a solution? Because we are the solution, and the solution is not for the liberation of people. We are the solution. When we are weaponized as a model minority, we are a solution for white supremacy.
Wow.
And his question is, what does it feel like to be a solution? And it should feel like shit, if you'll excuse the language.
Yeah.
And to me, that was a very, very powerful framing, right? We are absolutely integral to the functioning of racism, I think, as different kinds of, you know, non-Black, non-white people. I think we're integral to its functioning when we are weaponized to do it. And I think our job is to stop being those weapons. However So I would add, I think, accountability to the Black experience. Like in my personal life, the most healing people I have read. I mean, I'm in a very white space. I don't run across, anyone really but white people most of the time. But the most healing stuff for me at a very personal level, in terms of even self-acceptance, have been Black thinkers and writers. So, I mean, to me, this is kind of, so I just wanted to echo what they've said. I think that's just crucial.
I've always loved listening to you talk from the day I met you. Rainey?
I'm going to kind of deviate from what David and Monica and Ari said, but I'm going to actually come back. So I'm going to come full circle here. Don't worry about it. Because, in some ways, I feel like, last week on Black Pearls, we heard, last 2 weeks, actually, we heard, from this group of white people. And, one thing, in the workshops that we do, Monica and Dina, when especially towards the end of the day, when we talk about racial identity, we talk about what's in it for white people to end racism. For me, it's always helpful to know that a white person is in the movement for anti-racism for their own benefit. I think there is a power to selfishness, in terms of there's a genuine sort of drive that, that I want to know that a white person is genuinely in it for their own benefit. I feel the same way about Asian Americans. It's very easy for us to just say like, we're in it to support Black people. It's like, I want to know like, what's in it for you as an Asian American? Like, why do you want to end this? Because if our sort of motivation to be in this movement is all about just supporting other people, I don't think that's going to be genuine enough. How is your experience connected to what's going on? And in fact, how is it informed by anti-Blackness? And so for me, I think it is important for us to get proximate to understanding what, not even just saying like just to use the sort of example of COVID-19, right? Like not just saying like what Trump is saying, about the Chinese virus, but not if we get proximate to the data, we actually see that Asian American communities are dying from COVID at higher rates than white people. That's not a chance I'm willing to take for my own community. Here in Los Angeles, we can see that the rate of age-adjusted death rates for COVID-19 in Los Angeles for Asian Americans is 50% higher than white people in Los Angeles. That's not a chance I want to take. And so for me, like there must be a particular genuine self-interest in being a part of that movement. And so for me, it's the first thing I would say is just to get proximate with why are you in this movement? And then, as you get closer and to understanding that, you start to realize that the only way to get to self-liberation is what Dave is talking about, is by refusing to be used as that racial wedge against, to keep things in place. Because the model minority myth is not something that is just unique to just Asians. The model minority myth is the myth of meritocracy. It's the myth that is upholding, right, that this whole bootstraps mentality that is carrying this whole white supremacy access system together. And so so I think it's important for us to really know what is our skin in the game first. And because it's otherwise it's so easy without knowing that, I have to remind myself why I'm in the movement, because without that, it's just so easy for me to, in my white proximate geography, to just blend in and not have to think about this anymore. I could just, if I wanted to, right, I could just, say, all right, REI, I'm not gonna do these trainings anymore. I'm just gonna live my life with my family, and with the economic access that I have, just go on. And so, I think you have to start reminding ourselves, why we're in this movement. And once we get proximate, we start to realize, I think, more ways of that, why that is salient, and and understanding that while that might be the case for you, that is not the case for most of us, a lot of other people in the community. My best friend has just the complete opposite story to me, as a Vietnamese American who, parents came over here as refugees, who, lost family members due to COVID-19, just having, living in a neighborhood with Latinos, in East LA, completely different experience. And so getting proximate to the problem to remind us why we're in this movement, I think, is extremely important. And eventually that will take us to realizing that the only way to get to our liberation is undoing anti-Blackness and undoing white supremacy.
Oh, thank you, Rani. There's a question. Someone was one saying thank you to the panelists. As an Indian, it's great to see my experiences reflected in yours. I'm a 20-something and have really been struggling to reach my parents and have conversations with them about anti-Blackness in our community. They get quite angry and assume I'm calling them racist when I'm just trying to call attention to some of their problematic attitudes towards Black folks. Do you have any of you have advice for simple and accessible ways to educate my parents about the difference between explicit versus implicit and structural racism? I mean, I think all of what you said, we're going to have these, this is live on Facebook, and so people will be able to access it. You all have dropped incredible, valuable nuggets about covering so many things that I am just so moved by, and, you know, just so intrigued by what you've shared, David, when you were just talking about somebody wanting you to talk about the oppression of Asians, which is real, and also the way that that is a weapon of mass distraction, you know, to just kind of spread the peanut butter and, you know, just talk about everybody's oppression. And so there's just so much that we can take about. Any advice, though, about how to talk to, you know, Indian parents about racism?
I can tell you a story. When my father was still alive, he was a wholesaler, and we'd go to these trade shows across the South, and you'd set up your booths, right? And so you'd be adjacent to other people who had their booths. And there are a lot of immigrants who go to these trade shows because they import from China, they import from India. And so my dad had a temper. And so there was an exhibitor who had a booth next to his who was an Indian woman. And so they got into a fight. And this was at the end of the show when there really wasn't anybody around. And I'd gone off to get a Coke or something and came back, and they're shouting at each other. I'm going, oh no, you know, what's happened here? And so I hear my father saying, look at you, look how ugly you are, look how dark your skin is. Why should I listen to anything that you say? And she shot right back at him in a perfect Indian English. You can't even speak English properly. Why should I listen to anything that you say? And as I said, there weren't a whole lot of people here, and there actually weren't any kind of white people around. And it wasn't until many years later that I realized that whiteness was winning at that point. And you know what I would say to the parents is, whose words are coming out of your mouth? That is, you know, did Chinese people invent, you know, this idea that dark skin was bad? Did Indian people invent that not speaking English fluently was a marker of barbarity? No, you know, somebody else did. And I think when you kind of realize whose words are coming out of your mouth, you begin to get it.
Wow. So I need a commitment. Dina, this has been awesome. I know you missed the first part, but we were live on Facebook, and anybody that's trying to get back to this conversation, I would invite that person that raised that question. I'm on Monica Walker, Greensboro, on Facebook. Take them to the page, sit it in front of them. Let them listen to the wisdom that was dropped here tonight by this incredible collection of folks representing the diversity of the continent of Asia and beyond, and share that with them. But this is the commitment that I need. Unfortunately and fortunately, next week I have another set of guests on, and that's Suzanne Bundy and her group from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Broward County. We'll be talking about the organizing that's going on there. But Mukta, David, Rainey, Monica, and Air, I need to have you guys back. I just feel like that this conversation was so powerful, but it is not over. There was just so much that could be said. And I was blown away by what was said. I really, from the beginning, because I'd never done it before, I didn't want to put any of you on the spot, and I didn't want to commit you to 2 weeks because I didn't know if we had 2 weeks worth of conversation. Now I know we got a lot more. So I would like to promise folks out there that this was the beginning of a conversation. I'll talk with you guys privately offline and see if I can pull you together for another Thursday to continue it, because it's powerful. And it's powerful because you brought your authentic selves and your experiences, which we so badly need to hear about. So Dina, any last words?
I just love you guys. And, you know, Mukta, we use your, you know, it wasn't just the Monopoly game. It was just the way that you played it. It's the way that you recorded things. That is a standard part of REI workshops. And so if anybody doesn't know, that's Dr. Jose that, yes. Is the architect, one of the architects of that Monopoly game. So So anyway, you have all contributed enormously to our analysis and to our lives. And so we just sincerely love you and glad you're here. Mukta?
Yeah, Dina, I just want to say something to the young person who talked about the parents not understanding and being at odds with their parents. I think this is happening in so many homes right now, not just Asian homes and white homes. And I'm sure even in Black homes where, you know, strategies are different between generations. So I think my approach is don't give up, keep communicating, because for these young people, their parents are also their community. And sometimes it's a small community they've built, and not to give up on them. The parents are afraid, right? There's a lot of fear, which is why they're trying to control their young people. But and I feel like communication often takes us to a better place. Now, sometimes though, you have to walk away from people who just don't want to get it and do something more hopeful. But I wouldn't give up. First, I would really try to talk to them, just as a parent myself. And I love it that our children stay in touch with us. And, you know, so you know how valuable that is. And they learn so much from you and your groups.
Thank you, Mukta.
Yeah, and I'd like to confirm last week, live on Facebook, we touched almost 5,000 views and growing. So again, I am going to have them back. So stay tuned, pay attention, and they will be back. But again, thank you, David. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Mukta. Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Rainey. And we'll see you again soon.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody.
Very much.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.